Walcheren Island, the Netherlands, November the 7th, 1944. Number 4. Commando is the first unit ashore. The island is heavily fortified, the approaches swept by German gun positions, and the landing is going badly, in the way that all amphibious landings go badly. Noise, confusion, men in the wrong places, the plan surviving first contact for approximately 4 minutes before the situation takes over. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Dawson is commanding Number 4 Commando. He was wounded on D-Day 5 months earlier and returned to lead his unit anyway. In his hands is a submachine gun that is not the Sten that every other British infantryman carries. It is something different, lighter, more balanced, with a pistol grip at its point of balance rather than behind it, and a folding stock borrowed in concept from the German MP-40. It is a prototype. It is one of a small number of trial weapons that have found their way into the hands of commando officers through channels that the official record does not make entirely clear. It has no name that anyone outside the development program knows. It is the Patchett Machine Carbine, designed by a former motorcycle racer named George Patchett at a factory in Dagenham, Essex, demonstrated to the Ordnance Board in 1942, and still waiting, 2 years later, for someone to formally decide what to do with it. The war will end in 6 months. The trials will not conclude until after it does. Nothing will be adopted. George Patchett will spend the next 9 years watching his weapon compete against rivals, survive elimination after elimination, and wait while the institution that should have adopted it found reasons to delay. In 1953, 11 years after he first submitted a prototype, the British Army will designate his weapon the L2A1 and issue it as the standard submachine gun. It will remain in British service until 1994, 52 years from prototype to retirement. The weapon that nobody could find a reason to adopt, and nobody could find a reason to reject. George William Patchett was born in 1903. He raced motorcycles competitively before turning to engineering, and the precision he brought to mechanical design reflected a mind that understood performance under stress, the specific, non-negotiable demands that high-speed mechanical systems placed on materials and tolerances. He joined the Sterling Armaments Company in Dagenham, Essex, which had spent the early years of the war producing the Lanchester Machine Carbine, a weapon based directly on the German MP-28, solid and reliable, but heavy, expensive, and designed for the Royal Navy's specific requirements rather than general infantry use. As the Sten flooded production in 1941, Patchett began work on something different. His starting point was the Sten itself. The receiver tube diameter was retained, which allowed the new weapon to use existing tooling, but everything else was approached from first principles. The pistol grip moved forward on the receiver to the weapon's point of balance, a position that no other submachine gun of the era used, giving the firer natural, intuitive control without the nose-heavy bias that afflicted the Sten. When you held a Sten with your hand forward on the magazine housing, the only natural forward grip position, you were putting lateral pressure on the magazine feed lips, which was the primary cause of the Sten's notorious feed failures. The instruction not to use the magazine as a handhold was in every Sten training manual. Every soldier ignored it, because there was nowhere else natural to put the hand. Patchett gave the hand somewhere else to go. The stock folded underneath rather than fixed, reducing the weapon's length for vehicle crews and airborne troops, without the mechanical complexity of a side-folding design. The under-folding stock concept was borrowed from the German MP-38 and 40. Patchett was not too proud to take what worked from the enemy, but executed with a stronger locking mechanism. The bolt, in the most significant innovation, had helical grooves machined into its surface, grooves that forced dirt and carbon fouling outward from the receiver as the bolt cycled, rather than allowing it to accumulate and cause stoppages. On a Sten, fouling in the receiver was a constant maintenance concern. On the Patchett, the bolt cleaned itself with every shot. The magazine that Patchett developed in 1946, after the war, working on the problem he had identified during wartime testing, was a double-stack, single-feed curved design with internal rollers on the follower to reduce friction and ensure reliable feeding. Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons and Armament Research Services identified this magazine as one of the best submachine gun magazine designs ever produced. The Sten's single-feed straight magazine had been copied in a rush from the German MP-28 and had been causing stoppages since the first day British soldiers fired it. Patchett solved the problem the Sten had always had, and nobody had fixed. Patchett demonstrated his initial prototype to the Ordnance Board on the 25th of September 1942. The board recommended improvements and expressed interest in seeing the weapon developed further. That interest and its consequences would define the next decade of George Patchett's professional life. The Patchett Mark I underwent its first formal military testing in early 1944, when the British General Staff issued a specification for a new submachine gun to replace the Sten. The specification was reasonable: no more than 6 pounds 9mm parabellum ammunition, rate of fire no more than 500 rounds per minute, accurate enough to place 5 consecutive rounds in a 1-foot square target at 100 yards in semi-automatic mode. The Patchett met or exceeded every criterion. The Ordnance Board ordered 20 examples for further trials at a cost of £4,464. These were assembled and delivered to the board on April 28, 1944, 6 weeks before D-Day. Over the following months, while the armies of Britain, America, Canada and the Commonwealth were fighting their way across France and into Germany, the Patchett was being tested at Pendine in Wales, evaluated by Airborne Forces development teams, and compared against every other design the War Office could find. The most enduring mystery of the Patchett's wartime career involves Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Multiple sources have suggested that trial Patchetts were issued to British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. Matthew Moss, the historian who has researched the Patchett more thoroughly than anyone, stated clearly, after extensive investigation, that there is currently no documentary evidence to support this. What is documented is that 4 Patchetts were sent to the Airborne Forces Development Centre in April 1944 for evaluation, that a grainy photograph exists showing what appear to be members of the Free French SAS, with 2 Patchett prototypes, during Operation Amherst in April 1945, and that an Ordnance Board report from January 1951 specifically mentions that the Patchett had been used in action by Combined Operations Troops, the Commandos, and had been recommended as a replacement for the Sten in January 1945. The Arnhem story cannot be confirmed. The Walcheren story can. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Dawson carried one. It won its trials, and then the war ended. And because the war ended, the need for large quantities of new weapons suddenly collapsed, and the adoption of the Patchett, which had been the winner of its trials, by its trials' own assessment, was quietly set aside. Britain had millions of Stens. Britain no longer needed a new weapon badly enough to pay to produce one. The winner of the race found that the race had been cancelled at the finish line. If you have made it this far, and are not subscribed, that changes now. One click. The competition that followed in the post-war years was one of the more unusual chapters in British small arms history. The Patchett had won the wartime trials, but in the late 1940s, the Ordnance Board arranged a new round of preliminary trials, as if the previous result had not occurred, and invited a new set of competitors. The most serious rival was the BSA Machine Carbine, designed by Claude Perry at Birmingham Small Arms, an advanced design with a creative cocking mechanism in which the entire front handguard served as the charging handle. By 1948, the BSA was pulling ahead in trials as the Patchett suffered reliability issues. In the 1951 trials, the positions reversed. The Patchett was favoured. But then the EM2 rifle was adopted that same year, a bullpup design intended to replace both the rifle and the submachine gun in infantry use, which made the Patchett's adoption seem temporarily unnecessary. The EM2 was cancelled within months when NATO standardized on the 7.62mm round, and Britain fell into line. The cancellation of the weapon designed to make the Patchett obsolete immediately reopened the question of the Patchett's adoption. On September 18, 1953, The Patchett Mark II was designated the L2A1 and formally entered British Army service. After minor improvements, it entered mass production in 1955 as the L2A3, produced by the Sterling Company and becoming accordingly known as the Sterling submachine gun. The name of the man who designed it appeared on neither the designation nor the nickname. The Sterling, Patchett's weapon under its production name, served everywhere the British Army served, from the Korean War to the Gulf War. Malaya, Borneo, Aden, Northern Ireland, the Falkland Islands, the Persian Gulf. The L-34A1 silenced variant, developed directly from the same receiver, became one of the most capable, suppressed submachine guns of the Cold War period, and saw use with British Special Forces through multiple decades. The magazine that Patchett developed in 1946, a double-stack, single-feed curved design with internal rollers to reduce friction, is considered by armourers who have worked with both the Sterling and every generation of its competitors to be among the finest magazine designs ever produced for a submachine gun. The helical bolt grooves that distinguished the weapon from its first prototype were retained through every production variant and contributed to a reliability record in adverse conditions — mud, sand, Arctic cold, tropical humidity — that compared favourably with every contemporary and successor design. Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons, reviewing the Sterling's lineage for Armament Research Services, noted that it was George Patchett's gun, first prototyped all the way back in 1942, that would prove the winner across the entire post-war British SMG competition. The weapon remained in British Army service until 1994. Canada adopted it as the C1. India produced it under license as the SAF carbine. New Zealand, Malaysia, Nigeria, Argentina, and over a dozen other nations issued it to their forces. Over 1 million were produced. Robert Dawson carried the prototype onto Walcheren Island in November 1944, when it had no name and no official status, and the Army had not decided what to do with it. 50 years later, the weapon his commandos carried was still being issued to British soldiers. The trial that finished after the war it had been designed for was over. The weapon that nobody adopted in time became the weapon nobody could do without. George Patchett died in 1972. The Sterling his name never appeared on was still in production.